Hey, what up? Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Tonic podcast. The first topic we're going to be talking about today is something that is pretty relevant. It is the trial of Derek Chauvin. He was the police officer that put his knee on George Floyd for about 9 minutes back in May. And currently, the trial has started in Minneapolis, and it includes 3 counts of intentional homicide in attempting to accomplish an arrest. And if convicted, Chauvin could face up to 40 years in prison. So today, we're just going to dive into what these counts are and our reactions so far as this trial is ongoing. So Drew, how are you? This is a pretty heated topic, but other than that, how's life going?
Things are good here. People are getting vaccinated pretty rapidly where I live, which is exciting to hear. I'm hoping that within the next few weeks I can get on that list as well. I do. I'm okay. Let's get into this trial because obviously this the incident in question, right? The incident that led to the death of George Floyd. A lot of people are describing it as a murder, and that is what we're on trial for here. The murder of George Floyd happened almost a year ago now. Led to the largest civil rights movement in history, I think you could say. I mean, the gatherings we saw were not just on a massive scale in the United States, but across the world even. Tons of publicity and news around this trial. So it's one of the larger and bigger trials that I think is going on today and will be going on in around a few years. Every few years you have trials like this that get so much attention, and this is one of them that's really, really politically and culturally charged. So it is important to, especially when we're talking about the logistics of the courtroom and the intricacies of the law. It's very difficult to do this, but at some points you have to kind of put these emotions aside and look at the realities of the specifics of the laws we're looking at and what laws were broken. And so I hope that while I do want to discuss the cultural implications of this trial, we can at least try and dive into the nitty-gritty of some of these details without getting too wrapped up in the emotional aspect, at least for a moment.
Absolutely. And I totally agree with you. I think there's just so many facets to this trial, which is going to make it not only historic, but potentially quite implicating, I think, on how civil society in the U.S. potentially is going to be for the next couple months. I'd like to get into that maybe towards the end. But before we start, I just wanted to maybe discuss the 3 charges, just so everyone's kind of aware of what's actually being put forth here. And so Chauvin is facing 3 charges, which is second-degree unintentional felony murder. He's also facing third-degree depraved mind murder and second-degree manslaughter. And I just wanted to really fast, just explain these 3. Is that second-degree unintentional murder is basically that the state's prosecutors would have to show beyond reasonable doubt that Chauvin caused Floyd's death while assaulting him. This is actually the most serious charge, and it carries a sentence of about 10 to 15 years. And I want to make it clear off the beginning, we are not lawyers, but this information's out there, and it's fascinating. So the second charge is third-degree murder, and basically third-degree murder requires prosecutors to prove that someone caused the death of another by perpetuating an act eminently dangerous to others. And usually this is actually used for drug dealers. Say like Bob sells Joe some heroin, and the heroin ends up killing Joe. This would be the charge that a prosecutor would bring forth typically to get the drug dealer, right? It's like not directly murdering somebody, but the outcome was murder. But there was a precedent in Minneapolis actually where there was a police officer who was convicted of third-degree murder in the death of someone named Damon after she was unintentionally shot during a police investigation. So there is a precedent for this. And the third one is second-degree manslaughter. And in order to convict Chauvin of second-degree manslaughter, prosecutors would need to show beyond reasonable doubt that he was culpably negligent and took an unreasonable risk while detaining Floyd. And so I guess my initial take on this is that these are 3 very interesting charges because we keep seeing the term beyond reasonable doubt coming up, and I think that's where the defense is going to try to go, is they're going to try to muddle the waters on beyond reasonable doubt in these, because these are very specific charges, and it's going to be interesting to see if they can prove beyond reasonable doubt some of these charges.
Yes, right. And so that's That's a that's important thing to remember. That is, each charge comes with its own burden of proof, and so not every charge requires the same amount of, the, meeting that burden of proof to be convicted of amongst the jury. Off the bat though, I mean, the second degree murder could go. What I'm reading is could go as high as 40 years, and then the third degree murder, the lesser charge of third degree murder, could go up to 25 years. And then the final one carries a maximum penalty, the second degree manslaughter, of 10 years. Now, those don't always mean they're stacked on top of each other. A lot of times in cases where you do have multiple charges like this, depending on the defendant and how the trial goes, but you do see commonly a thing where someone will serve a term consecutively. So if he has 10 years for the second degree manslaughter and then 25 for everything else, that 10 years is served consecutively within that 25. Well, basically serving it at the same time, to put it simply. But we don't know. We're not there yet. But just keep in mind that even if he gets convicted of all three, it doesn't necessarily mean they add on top of each other to 80-something years. It still could be 35, 40 served consecutively. So there's a lot of these intricacies in our justice system that it's important to remember. And you mentioned that lesser charge of third degree murder. I guess in the writing in Minnesota, it says that it has to be committed an act eminently dangerous to others. And this was a point where the defense appealed to have this charge removed, and it was removed for a time, but then the prosecution appealed back, and it was put back in the trial. So that charge was dropped, then the charge was put back on, and now he's got all these three charges facing him right now in this trial, and they, we've said, come with some hefty time if convicted.
Yes, and so I'm just curious, of these three charges, which one do you think, and I'm just asking, there's
Sure.
no obvious answer to this, but which one do you think would be the most possible, I guess?
Well, and I'm no legal expert, but I did watch some videos from a pretty funny YouTuber. Well, not YouTuber. He's a lawyer first. He's a criminal defense lawyer named Bruce Rivers, but he has a YouTube channel where he gives some insight into, big cases. Particularly, he does a lot with entertainment and rap. But he also talks about this trial because it's so big. And he talked about how, he's also a lawyer in Minnesota. He vlogs from across the street where the trial's going on. This criminal defense lawyer, and he talks about how he thinks it's pretty open and shut for the second degree manslaughter. At least for that charge, which is the one that carries the lowest burden of proof, and that's the one with the maximum penalty of 10 years, as you can see on my screen here if you're reading on the video. And that would be, prosecutors would have to prove that George Floyd's death was caused by Chauvin's negligence in creating an unreasonable risk and consciously taking chances of causing death or great bodily harm. Now, what we've seen so far is, and just a lot more today, is that, one of the defense's angles is that, this was in line with training, or perhaps even that he was trained incorrectly. We're now seeing that a lot of not only his own coworkers in the police department in Minneapolis, but other trainers of use of force for the police department have said this is not something that they train. This is not something that was not accepted previously by the police department, and so Chauvin was acting outside of police protocol, which I think then makes the second degree manslaughter pretty damn plausible that he's going to get convicted of that. I think the tough one is the one where you have the murder with the mannequin 10, or what did you say it was?
Well, there's second degree unintentional murder, which could be difficult because it's basically you have to show beyond any doubt that Chauvin caused the death while assaulting him. The third degree one is basically the one that says you created a dangerous situation for someone and harmed others around you, which to me seems kind of vague and pretty hard to actually consolidate, if you know what I mean.
So let's get into this. So let's start with the lesser charge, the third degree murder of act eminently dangerous to others, and that the reason that it was appealed successfully is that others part. The defense then said, look, he acted against, the act was involving him and George Floyd and all the other witnesses around, as emotionally distressed as they were. No one else was in any danger. And so that's why at one point that the appeal worked. However, then when the prosecution came back and appealed that decision, they successfully argued that no, that law means accidentally to others, and the others include George Floyd. George Floyd
Right.
considered an other in this case because he, and so they argued that. So that one is a little vague as well. So that might be a little tougher. But I think that if the precedent stands that George Floyd counts as an other in this legal writing, then that he might get hit with that one as well. And then the toughest one is that second-degree murder, even unintentional. I think it also comes with, in Minnesota, is that it has to happen while committing or attempting to commit another felony offense. And so it can't be in a vacuum on its own. And so in this case, they're saying that the felony offense was assault, and then that unintentionally led to a murder. Mm-hmm. Which is,
right.
It's going to be tough to prove. And then, like you said, there's this angle of the drug usage and the fact that Chauvin was not the cause of death. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that and what's been said about that angle on the prescription drug usage.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, and I'll be honest up front that I haven't actually looked too much into the drug usage charges. I know.
Well, there's not the charges, but like the aspect of that.
Yeah. Excuse me. Yeah, bad way to put it, but yeah, like I know that he was a drug user. There was definitely a record of him being a drug user, but it's interesting because the defense's argument is kind of centered around the cause of death, right? Like they are trying to muddle the waters, and I mean I think muddle the waters sounds a bit biased. They're trying to provide an alternative reason, and so Floyd suffered from a heart severely compromised by hypertension and cardiac issues, and his medical condition was further compromised by the use of drugs and alcohol. That was what the autopsy revealed. It revealed none of the telltale signs of asphyxiation, no hemorrhaging, no injuries to the structures of the neck. And moreover, I guess the autopsy report argued that usually someone would lose conscious in 10 seconds and would die in 3 to 5 minutes with that pressure applied where people are arguing it did. But then the medical examiner found that Floyd's death was attributable to the pressure applied to his neck and torso. And so I think you have the prosecution looking at the medical examiner's side of it, but you have the defense more looking at the initial autopsy, which showed that it was actually not asphyxiation. Sorry, I have trouble with that word. And so that's, I think, where it's going to get complicated, is because there's enough information on both sides that are trying to kind of overlie the other one in this. And so I think it gets really hard to say, was Floyd actually killed just by the force on his neck? Or was he already potentially having issues that could have been induced by being on fentanyl, and maybe the strangulation and the pressure on his neck added to that? And I truly think it's a complicated issue because I am no. Yeah, sorry, go.
No, I'm agreeing. It is a complicated issue, but there are avenues to look at it, because I agree with the idea that if you have fentanyl in your system, that it probably, it makes it more difficult to breathe, right? That's something that we know is a side effect of that drug. But there's a lot of steps that happens in the context of George Floyd being on these symptoms. So one was, before George Floyd was on the ground, he informed the officers that he had and ingested drugs, right? So he had informed them that, hey, I'm on a lot of stuff right now. And during the 9 minutes and 26 seconds when his neck, which the officer's leg was on George Floyd's neck, 4 minutes of that time, George Floyd had no pulse, right? Half of that time that leg was down, he had no pulse. And it is part of police training to check for a pulse, especially if you have someone under the influence of drugs.
Absolutely.
And then on top of that, you have when the EMTs got there and asked the officer to check vitals. The officer denied them the ability to do that, which is, again, outside of protocol. So I think
Right.
so yes, you're absolutely right that the defense is going to try and say, hey, it was not Chauvin that killed him. It was the drugs and the stress. It happened internally. But I think that even if you buy that argument that, yeah, maybe it was more the drugs than but it was still the overall situation around it in which Derek Chauvin completely had so much negligence as to George Floyd's state of being, had went against so much protocol that he has to get charged with at least that manslaughter charge. And then
Yeah.
go ahead.
No, I mean, absolutely. I think you're spot on right there. And that's the thing, is why I think that second degree manslaughter charge again would be pretty applicable to this, mainly because to me this sounded like bad policing and someone who did not know how to actually handle this correctly in the situation. To me, it's a moot point if he was on fentanyl or not. Like, I get that if he was on a drug that, could link to heart issues, breathing problems, obviously it's going to expedite the issue. But Chauvin at the beginning did not handle this situation correctly. Right. And that to me is what put Floyd at an unreasonable risk, which is used in the language for second degree manslaughter. And it talks about culpability negligent, right? And both of those things I think really shine on that charge, is because I know, like, a lot of conservatives now, which it's interesting how they've really flipped on this, but they want to, blame Minneapolis and the Minneapolis Police Department. But to me, it sounds like Chauvin individually made decisions that were not actually taught, and it was bad policing. And that's why, if Floyd was on drugs and that led to his death or not, the way that Chauvin handled the situation probably didn't help it. And I think that's why that second degree manslaughter would be applicable.
Yeah. So I think that one with the 40 years charge might be a little bit tougher. And again,
Yeah.
the nature of our justice system is that the prosecution has to convince the entire jury, whereas the defense only has to convince one, right? Because if you don't have a consensus, then you have a hung jury. So the defense has to do like a lot less than the prosecution in terms of like convincing and burning of proof, and that's a good thing. That's the idea we live in this country of innocent until proven guilty, and like in other countries it's the other way around, where you're guilty until proven innocent. So it should be a good thing that the prosecution has to overwhelmingly prove something of the charge, but that can lead to instances where perhaps people feel that justice has shorted them, where people feel that this was a full-blown murder, and personally, I kind of do as well. I think the 9 minutes is crazy, putting yourself on that neck and refusing aid. So I do want to kind of shift a little bit to like the cultural aspect, because there's one thing I want to mention first, is that very interestingly, both attorneys, the lead prosecuting attorney and the lead defense attorney, both had a moment in their opening statements where they mentioned how they wanted to leave politics out of the courtroom. Right. The prosecuting attorney said, right here, right now, there's nothing else, but it's just a trial on these facts against this defendant, right? Right. But and leave the media and the political hubbub around it aside. It's very admirable. Obviously, that's how a court should operate. We don't want to have political leanings in come into play. But the reality is, with a trial of this size, they do. So I wanted to tell you
really quickly. Sorry.
Sure.
Before we get into the culture, I just really quick think that we should touch on what's actually happened in the trial so far.
Sure. I mean, yeah, okay.
Because I actually think over the last couple of days, the defense's argument has actually, because the defense wants to open up the door to how he died, they've brought in a lot of witnesses from the Minneapolis Police Department. And it's actually looking less good, because it's almost like the Defense Department, not the Defense Department, but the defense side is opening up Pandora's box, because now we've had the the police chief of the Minneapolis Police Department saying that this was murder. We had Lieutenant Zimmerman of the department who said that putting a knee on the neck was uncalled for,
Yeah.
and he was never trained to do so. We had the girl who put the video out, who's underage, so her full name hasn't been given, who also talked about how this was just like, I almost feel like the longer this goes on, the worse it gets for the defense side. That's all I just wanted to touch on, is that I just think that the longer this goes, because now we're having training experts coming out and saying, yeah, this is not how the police department trains their people. This was Chauvin's decision. And that kind of flips the entire rights argument that it was the city's fault, not his.
That's a very good point. And yeah, maybe I perhaps jumped the gun. No, you make a good point, is that it is rare to see a trial like this where so many fellow officers testify against a police defendant. There is the notion of the blue line, right? And this is not, pulled out of nowhere. It's very studied of the protective culture within the police force, that it's a fraternal, it's like a fraternity, like you're part of a group and you protect each other within that group. So it is very rare to see not just one, but a plethora of police officers actively testify against Chauvin, being like, no, he does not represent anything we do, right? The police chief of the Minneapolis Police Department testifying against him. I mean, your own boss, it's his boss, being like, no, he effed up. He completely did not follow protocol in any way. You also have use of force trainers, right? Guys that are specifically, their profession is to train police in the correct use of force and to not exceed it, right? They have now said that this was an excessive use of force. It is not looking good for Chauvin. So that's very good point. So I wanted to bring that back to the conversation about culture, because it is, like we said, there's this blue line culture that is now showing to have some cracks, right? That I saw another commentator mention that, like what I just said, that is very rare to see police testify so willingly against other officers, and in such a quick succession. But then, yeah, like civil rights activist Al Sharpton said recently that, Derek Chauvin is in that courtroom, but America is on trial. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that comment. Is America on trial?
Yes, I would think so, because I was talking with our buddy Grayson, and he's been on the show a few times. We were talking about this a few days ago, and I was like, there seems to be a disconnect between just the utilitarian, what is right for society in this case, and maybe what the legal system is going to carry out in this case. And to me, it does show that if, let's just say hypothetically, if Chauvin was to be acquitted, it would be completely detrimental, I think, to our country as a whole, because I think even if it would show how, if the American people even full-heartedly believe that this was murder, if somehow he was acquitted, I think it would show that it would actually back up the argument that there are systematic issues with our criminal justice system. And because I think this case is super specific and super special, just because there hasn't been a murder quite like this caught on tape. And so since May, I think a lot of people have already developed their opinion. There's not a lot of gray area with this case. Like, if you talk to anyone, probably center left or center right, I think they're going to say that this was murder. Now we've had Fox News and some of the more right-wing propaganda networks have started to kind of muddle the waters, just kind of with how the culture in our country is going on the right. But my big issue is that I read an article in the New York Law Journal today that talked about, well, the article's called, "Can Derek Chauvin Possibly Be Acquitted?" And they bring up an interesting cultural argument for why he could be acquitted. It's that basically the jury knows that they're being held together by what the public thinks. Like it or not, the public has already made their minds up. But then again, the judge and the jury want to prove that they're isolated and separate from public opinion, that they're not being swayed by public opinion. And I worry that this could be one of those historical cases where the court wants to make a point about being separated from public opinion. And I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I worry that in an attempt to prove that they're so separated from the public that maybe they could acquit him. And I feel like I don't totally agree with that statement that America's on trial, because I think most Americans think it was abhorrent, but I think it's our system that's on trial, because I think it's our system that, I mean, look at these charges, that are going forth. Like, there's no charge for just directly murdering someone on camera. Like, there's no charge that just says that, like, no charge that makes it black and white. Instead, we have these kind of convoluted charges that we're hoping will get him. And I just worry that he could be acquitted, but it's not because the American people want him to be acquitted. It's because our system is so vague and gray that he could. And maybe that's what's going to end up, and I don't want to see what happens next. But I don't know, man. It's really tough to me, because I think he's guilty and I think he killed him, but I don't know if the legal precedent is there to do it.
Yeah, that's an interesting take, because I do feel that I've heard the same sentiment, that a lot of people are in agreement that, I mean, left and right, whatever political stance, I do think a lot of people are in agreement that the cop went too far. The cop certainly did something that was not justified. His use of force was not in comparison to the crime that happened, which was a counterfeit $20 bill, a nothing crime. So at least at least in that sense, I think most people are in agreement. But I think when Reverend Al Sharpton says that, America is on trial, I do think that this trial is kind of becoming this culmination of this decades-long movement to bring a light to the police brutality that is going on against African Americans, in particular. And this is, again, backed up by the data that in Minneapolis, police are 7 times more likely to use violence against a black suspect than they are a white suspect for the same crime, right? For the same crime. So I see this as I understand the rhetoric Al Sharpton uses, even though in the reality of the courtroom, you can't have that sentiment, right? If the prosecution lawyer said that, or the defense lawyer said something like that, the judge would get mad because the courtroom is a very different place. But I do understand why people feel like America's on trial, because this led to the largest publicity around it. It led to a growth in the Black Lives Matter movement. As much as polarized as we've gotten, the Black Lives Matter movement, got, I think, probably record of public approval during the height of the George Floyd protests. So I think, and I think there's an interesting point that I've heard from a few other civil rights advocates. They want to keep reminding people that this is a larger issue. They don't want it to just all be pinned on Derek Chauvin being a lone asshole. They want it to remind her that, no, this isn't just about George Floyd. It's also about all the way from Tamir Rice, all about Breonna Taylor, as far back as Rodney King, right? As this goes. So, so I understand the rhetoric that America is on trial, but I also agree with you that I do think a majority of people think that something wrong here happened. We can at least agree that something very wrong here happened, and hopefully find some sort of justice. But what is justice when George Floyd can't be brought back to life, right?
Yes, and this is one of those things where it's almost like public opinion and public sentiment and probably what is right are moving ahead of the tangible justice system that we have. We see this time and time again where sometimes people are ahead of the law in terms of where the public opinion's at. I mean, it takes the courts a long time to catch up.
Yeah.
And I just am really concerned that the public thinks that this case has already been settled, but the jury hasn't, and the jury wants to prove that they're independent from public opinion. I mean, there was a guy who was kicked out of the jury. I think it was last week in the first couple days, probably day one, and he had just expressed his thoughts that the police do single out African Americans, and he was told to leave by that. There are certain people that are being like the people that are still there, they're being asked to do something that I would never want to do.
Yeah.
They're being asked to balance justice with what is right. And sometimes, usually those are supposed to go hand in hand. But as we've seen, and you mentioned these other cases, they don't. And I'm just really concerned is that this is a case, like, especially with COVID, everyone was at home. Everyone saw this case. We all got super heated about it back at the time it happened, that everyone already thinks that this is settled. And I think for the sake of this country, but again, this isn't legal, but for the sake of this country, he needs to face repercussions. He really does, because there's so much anger and sadness and fear in this country right now. And to let a guy off like this, who I just think it would be detrimental to any form of unity. I mean, I can just imagine what like Chicago or Minneapolis will look like if Chauvin's off.
People will protest pretty vehemently, and I imagine some of it will be violent because
protest. I don't know how much protest is going to be happening after that.
Well, it'll be a combination of both, but it will certainly be both rioting and protesting. I think people would be incredibly upset if he gets off scot-free. I do think, though, again, we're no legal experts to wrap this up, but the legal experts I've looked at and like lawyers that I've watched and heard commentary from, they do believe he's going to get convicted of something. They don't think I don't think anyone thinks he's going to get everything, but I do think that at least that manslaughter charge, I mean, is just so much evidence against this guy for that manslaughter charge. Like the fact that you have his whole own police department basically throwing him under the bus. I don't see how you could have him not get something, convicted of something. But like we said, I mean, the jury is the jury, and your peers are your peers, and who knows what they'll do. You have to beyond a reasonable doubt, but certainly it's probably the biggest case in the last 10 years, or one of the for sure, and really will either be a catalyst for a lot of uncertainty and tough times, or hopefully maybe be the catalyst to turn the ship and begin, reforming our justice system to be more equitable and actually, have policing that doesn't lead to deaths like this. But who knows, man? I mean, is there anything else you want to say? I mean, obviously this trial is still ongoing for those out there, so we don't know the end of it.
Well, I would just say, for the defense of my ex political pundits that I used to follow on the right, they do bring up an interesting point. Is that I think you shared, what was it, 17 or 18 times Chauvin's done something that's been considered misconduct.
Yeah,
and he was still brought back. I do think there's a valid question about, okay, Minneapolis didn't train him specifically to do what he did to George Floyd, but they also allowed a guy with almost 24 issues to still come back.
Yeah.
And that, to me, like, as you know, I've been a bit critical of the term systematic racism because I think it's hard to actually explain what that can mean. But I think this is an example of systematic issues. I'm not going to say just directly racism, but there's systematic issues with this guy. He's a bad apple. And I would hope that at least maybe police departments realize that when the spotlight's on you, you can't just let these bad apples stay.
I mean, talk about a horseshoe conversation point, because yeah, man, I agree. If that's what the conservative pundits are saying, that, well, the Minneapolis Police Department shouldn't have let them be so corrupt for so long, then like, yeah, damn right. Let's investigate the police departments more. How about that? Maybe let's put way more accountability on police departments and who they hire and how they have these internal. If someone's investigated 17 times, that's what it was I think let's get the exact stat. But yeah, you mentioned it. It was Derek Chauvin had 19 policy infractions over 18 years. Over 18 years of police force, he had 19 infractions. So averaging one a year, this guy does something wrong. This guy
sounds like a bad cop.
Yeah, exactly. It sounds like a bad apple. And it sounds like the Minneapolis Police Department did nothing to remove that bad apple. Now, that doesn't mean that the bad apple can get off scot-free for his actions, right? Mm-hmm. If the bad apple murdered somebody, then he should be charged with murder. But then also, yeah, let's take it a step further. Let's start investigating police departments that don't fire cops after multiple infractions. I mean, how many times do you have to mess up before you're fired from your job, right? Why do cops get so much protection? Well, because the blue line. They have strong police unions, and the criminal justice system rarely prosecutes officers, and DAs don't like to prosecute cops because it's bad for their look. All this and this and that, right? Things that have been discussed on this podcast and plenty of times before are all the reasons why we don't investigate Minneapolis Police Department as thoroughly as we should have. So if that's what conservative pundits are saying, then I am all for it. Talk about a horseshoe of agreement, because yeah, man, let's have way more accountability in our police departments.
Absolutely, and we'll keep you guys in touch with this. I unfortunately don't think this is going to be the end.
No.
I think we're going to see some interesting times ahead in this case. Hopefully, he gets convicted. But yeah, let us know what you think. As usual, we're on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, all that other jazz. You know the drill. So take care. Have a great rest of your week, and let's just hope justice is served here.
Yeah, let's hope. Thank you all. Take care.